Chapter 20 deals with the lymphatic system. So first let's define what is the lymphatic system. So you see in your text the lymphatic system consists of three main parts. You have lymphatic vessels, you have lymph, which is the fluid, and you have lymph nodes. Comprising the lymphatic system, along with the types of organs and tissues we find in the lymph system, are the spleen, the tonsils, the thymus, and lymph nodes. This is in addition to phagocytic cells, which we've talked about briefly before, and also lymphocytes. So we'll see these more in chapter 21, which is the immune system chapter. So just to review briefly some things about the lymphatic system that are important, it's necessary to first define the lymphatic system drainage. So when we see lymphatic vessels that are a networking of drainage vessels, we see that they all run towards the heart. So make sure you remember when we talk about lymphatic system that everything drains towards the heart. And we're going to see a picture of that in a second here. The fluid is called lymph. So once the fluid enters a lymphatic capillary and starts its journey back towards the heart through the lymphatic vessels, the fluid is called lymph. As you might have noticed in your text, approximately 3 liters a day of fluid are returned back into circulation. Without this 3 liters, if this 3 liters was all stuck in our tissue, we would certainly have edema in our tissue. So the importance of it is vast to keep the fluids in our body circulating properly. So take a look at this picture that you find in your textbook. You're going to see that the venous system and the arterial system are listed in this first picture, and you also see the blood capillary. Now, when we looked at this blood capillary system back in chapter 19, there was no lymphatic addition. So you should see in this particular image down here that not only do we have the networking of blood vessels, but we also have the networking of the capillaries for the lymphatics as well. Not very specific about which tissue we are located in here, but we do see that there are blood capillaries interwoven between lymphatic capillaries. You also see in this image up at the top here how everything is flowing towards the heart. So this is going to be the heart right here. It should be labeled heart. So it's a one-way system all flowing up, and as it's flowing up, as you might see, there are little tiny nodes along the way, and these are your lymph nodes, actually forming filtration sites as the fluid moves up towards the heart. We have specialized features in our lymphatic capillaries that we find for increased permeability. Remember, permeability means the ability to pass through something. So we have these mini valves that are made up of these flaps, and so these mini valves, which you can see here, allow the fluid to flow in. Okay, the fluid flows in but not out. So it starts this process of one-way flow into the lymphatic capillaries. We have a specialized type of lymphatic capillary present in our intestines that's called a lacteal, and the lacteals are important because they absorb digested fats and are transporting this fat through the lymphatic system, so it's actually called chyle at this point. And this chyle is basically lymph mixed together with fat, and it directly dumps it into the bloodstream, and then it will travel around to be processed either by the liver or by other tissues. Flipping over to this image, we see that there is a kind of map of the lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes throughout the body. So as they start as capillaries, they will begin to merge into larger, what are called collecting vessels, and these collecting vessels will then merge to form trunks, and these trunks will form the ducts, the 2 large ducts of the body. So if you're looking in your text, you're going to see that there are lumbar, and there are bronchiomediastinal, subclavian, jugular, and intestinal trunks that are important for drainage. But looking at this image, you might be able to see the difference, and I didn't include the key, but it should have green and red. You should be able to see green and red shades in here. So I'm just going to draw a line hang on, draw a line right here. Okay, dividing the body. So you should see that the body is not evenly distributed in its drainage. So let me go ahead and write on here the two ducts that will bring, and they connect approximately right here, the two ducts that will bring the fluid back into venous circulation, called the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. Notice the inequality. The right lymphatic duct drains the arm on the right side and the upper body on the right side, whereas the thoracic duct drains the left upper body, arm and head, and both legs. So we see here a unequal distribution. However, both ducts will be added back into circulation where I drew these circles, which is approximately the point where the jugular vein meets the subclavian vein, merging to form the brachiocephalic vein on both the right and the left sides. Lymphatic flow is a low pressure system, similar to how the veins, if you remember from chapter 19, the arterial flow has a very large, steep pressure gradient that drives the flow of blood from the high pressure aorta into the lower pressure arterioles. However, the venous system, as you might recall, has a less steep drop-off, approximately 15 to 17 millimeters of mercury back to the right atrium, which is approximately 0. So we see the similar low pressure system for the lymphatic system. Therefore, we have mechanisms that will aid the lymph in being able to travel back to the heart. The first thing we have is milking of the skeletal muscles. This is exactly the same type of mechanism that we saw in the venous flow. Basically, the vessel will sit near a skeletal muscle, and when the skeletal muscle moves, it will push the fluid through the vessel only one way, because if we recall, there are valves located in these vessels that will prevent the flow backwards. Number 2 is pressure changes during breathing. So in normal breathing, this is the same as veins as well. When pressure in the air is formed, and when we pull on this pressure using our lungs, it is through the process of osmotic pressure that the fluid will be moved. Similar to if you were to have a enclosed space, such as a hose, and you suction on one end of the hose, it will pull the fluid or siphon the fluid through the hose based on the pulling pressure. So similar to this is our thoracic cavity during breathing. Number 3, we have valves, large valves, to prevent backflow. It's pretty simple. Also, pulsations of nearby arteries. Pulsations of nearby arteries can help to move the fluid towards the heart. And also, number 5, a small amount of smooth muscle in the walls of the lymphatic vessels will contract to push the lymph fluid back towards the heart. So these are the 5 things that aid in lymph flow. Moving forward, we have lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are an integral part of the lymphatic system and also the immune system, so we see overlapping systems here. The lymphocytes are going to be talked about in greater detail in chapter 21, but for right now, we need to remember just the brief functions of the T and the B cells. So T cells are important because they can do several things. So we have cytotoxic T cells, we have helper T cells, etc., that are important for destroying pathogens, or, as in the case of T helper cells, they help to activate the immune system. Okay, so T cells versus B cells. B cells are important because they secrete very important proteins called antibodies. And you guys have heard of antibodies. We talked about them in the blood chapter. So an antibody is something that will mark an antigen, which is a foreign substance, for destruction by phagocytosis or by other means such as neutralization, precipitation, agglutination, etc. We'll talk in chapter 21 about all the ways that antibodies react with antigens. So for right now, this is what I need you guys to remember about T cells and B cells. In this particular image of your text, you will see the different types of lymphoid organs, tissues and organs. In this image, we can also designate primary versus secondary organs. The primary organs are those where the T and the B cells that we just talked about, the lymphocytes, are going to mature. So the T and B cells are going to mature coincidentally in the thymus gland for the T cell, and for the B cell in the bone marrow. So just to recall again, all blood cells are formed where? In which type of tissue? Hopefully you said the red bone marrow. So both of these two cells are formed in the bone marrow. However, the B cell remains in the bone marrow to mature, whereas the thymus gland will migrate, the T cells will migrate to the thymus gland for maturation. Secondary organs include the tonsils, the spleen, what are called Peyer's patches, and the appendix. Also lymph nodes, which you don't see in this picture, but they are considered to be secondary lymph organs as well. So we're going to briefly go over kind of the function of each of these organs. Starting with the lymph node, we see here an image blown up of a lymph node. Notice there are entryways and exitways for the fluid to flow in and out. We see here there are, in this picture, 5 different entry vessels. These are called afferent vessels. And as you may recall from your study of the nervous system chapter, afferent means into, such as the afferent neurons that are going into the brain, bringing sensory information to the brain, whereas the outflow are called efferent. And similar to the nervous system again, efferent neurons are considered to be motor neurons, the ones that are leaving the brain going back out into the body. The fact that there are more afferents than efferents is important, because what this does is it establishes a stagnant flow. So there's more fluid coming in, than there is exiting. It creates the stagnant flow inside. Stagnant meaning it's not really moving fast, it's just kind of lingering. And this is important because it gives the lymph node time to perform its functions. So we have macrophages that are important for filtering out the particles or pathogens that might be inside of the lymph node. The two main functions of the lymph nodes, therefore, are 1, to filter the lymph that's traveling through it, and 2, to serve as a point of activation for the different types, or really lymphocytes, and also for the lymphocytes to be able to sit in one place and mount an attack if there is an antigen that might be present. Some of you may or may not know that cancer cells are often traveling through our lymph, and this is how metastatic processes occur with cancer. So lymph nodes can become secondary cancer sites if the cancer gets lodged into the lymph node. It can also just simply, cancer cells travel through the lymph node and through the lymph in general and then pop up somewhere else in the body. So say it starts primarily as maybe a breast cancer, but then we see that you now have spots of cancer in your maybe bone tissue. So the lymph and then consequently the bloodstream can provide this avenue for cancerous tissue to be able to spread throughout the body metastatically. So now I'll take a minute to explain this organ to you. Do you guys like my jokes? Silly. It's a very rich, blood-rich organ located in your abdominal cavity on the left side. Okay, so it's the left upper quadrant, really, just below the stomach, just deep to the stomach. It is considered to be the largest lymphoid organ. It has an artery coming in called the splenic artery. It has a vein coming out called the splenic vein. The area where the arteries enter is called the hilum. And we're going to see this. This was actually in the lymph node as well. I didn't mention it. But the general area where vessels go in and out, we also see this in the lungs where the airways and the vessels go in and out, is called the hilum. So the functions of the spleen are proliferation of lymphocytes. Remember, the word proliferate means to multiply quickly. And also it provides a site for immune surveillance. Also, the spleen is said to be the red blood cell graveyard. I know it's kind of morbid sounding, but this is where blood cells go to live out their last days. They are destroyed here. Typically, when they're destroyed, the iron in the red blood cell will be saved for later use. Also, the spleen is important for storing platelets, and also is said to be the site of fetal red blood cell production. So remember, in our as we're producing blood embryologically, we don't have a lot of bone tissue starting out, so other organs can have the ability to produce red blood cells. There are two areas of the spleen called red pulp and white pulp, and these areas are named as such based on the colors and the presence of which type of blood cell is found here. So as you might guess, the red pulp is where the red blood cells are going to be filtered out. Also, there is some pathogen destruction here. And the white pulp is going to be where immune system function occurs, mostly with lymphocytes appearing in these little clusters around the red pulp. Make sure you guys understand the concept of malt. So we're not talking about a beverage or the things that you eat. Malt is a abbreviated term that means mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. This is a very important tissue. It's found in the body around places where pathogens are trying to enter. So we see these in the digestive tract, both the mouth and the anus / urethra, also the nose, the respiratory tract. All these areas are lined with tissue called mucosa. You should remember this from your study in AP1. Okay, mucosal tissue. So the type of epithelial tissue, so the ones that we're going to focus on are tonsils, what are called Peyer's patches, which I already mentioned, Peyer's patches, and the appendix. Okay, so these three things are all malt, which are a specialized type of lymphoid tissue. The first type of malt, the tonsils. Palatine tonsils, lingual tonsils, pharyngeal tonsils, okay, are all found in the mouth/nose area. So the pharyngeal tonsils are all the way up at the top up here. Okay, the palatine tonsils are found in the mouth, and then the lingual tonsils at the base of the tongue. And so the point of these three tonsils, and we see here a histologic view of the tonsil, they have these invaginations, these long invaginations called crypts. And so what these crypts do is they trap bacteria or particles that are coming into the mouth/nose. And so when they are trapped, it allows the lymphocytes to be able to come to this area to destroy a lot of things at one time. It's just risky, as it says in your text, risky to lure bacteria into tissues. People, especially in the 80s, who had repetitive tonsillitis were simply underwent procedures where they had their tonsils removed. It's not so much done anymore. The incidence of tonsillectomies has decreased dramatically over the years. But it allows the immune system to become activated and to build memory cells against these potential pathogens by trapping them all in these crypts. The second two and last two malt structures have similar functions. So first let's talk about where they're located. The Peyer's patches are located in the distal portion of the small intestine, whereas the appendix is located on the proximal side of the large intestine. So we're talking the farthest points of the small intestine versus the cecum, or the beginning of the large intestine. So I know you guys have probably heard of appendix. You might not have heard of Peyer's patches. However, they both do the same thing functionally. So they destroy bacteria, making sure that bacteria do not breach the intestinal walls. That's important. If the bacteria goes from inside the intestine, you guys might remember from previous studies that the large intestine down here has a designed bacterial flora. And so this bacteria is what we call our good bacteria. However, if this bacteria goes from inside the large intestine out into the abdominal cavity, it can cause sepsis and it could cause death. So we have these protective malt structures, the appendix and the Peyer's patches, to make sure that any of the bacteria that are coming out or get out of their design homes are destroyed. Also, it generates memory lymphocytes. So generating the memory lymphocytes will be important, because then if we're ever re-exposed to something, we have memory cells, memory lymphocytes that will aid in the immune response for the next time. The last thing we're going to go over today is the thymus. The thymus gland is a bilobed, meaning it has two sides, which you see here, two lobes that are inferior to the neck. So here we see the neck region, so it's mediastinum, inferior to the cervical region, but above the heart is where it lies in the body. It's most active during childhood. So if you recall about immunity, we are not really born with a very strong immune system. We have to be exposed to things in order to build immunity to antigens. So it's the most active and largest during childhood when we are gaining our exposure. And then as we go into adolescence, it starts to atrophy. Remember, atrophy means to shrink to where it is rather small by the time we are into adulthood. However, even though it's atrophying, it can still produce immunocompetent, meaning successful immune system cells, though they are produced at a slower rate. Now, the thymus is broken into lobes. There is a cortex and a medulla. You don't need to worry about that. But I do want you guys to remember that the thymus has a separated blood system. There is a structure called the blood-thymus barrier, which is similar to the blood-brain barrier, if anyone remembers from the nervous system chapters. The blood-thymus barrier is important because it keeps the developing lymphocytes, specifically T cells, away from the bloodstream. It does not want these T cells to be exposed prematurely to antigens, so it keeps them away from it. Therefore, the thymus is one of the only organs that does not directly fight antigens. Because of this blood-thymus barrier, it keeps the antigens away from the thymus tissue, and thus the T cells do not have premature activation and exposure to circulating antigens. Thanks for watching, guys. This was the Lymphatic System, Chapter 20. Tune in soon for an update with the Immune System, Chapter 21.